Hey, Book Dragons, I am so glad that you joined me today. I recently read Shogun by James Clavell, and I can't wait to talk to you guys about this book. So grab a drink if you need one, some snacks, whatever you want, and let's get ready to talk about this book. I'm going to start kind of with my normal process of giving you the basics of the book, what it's about. We'll talk about some of the themes that are presented in the book. We'll talk about the characters, and I'm really excited to discuss this, so let's dive in. Shogun was written by James Clavell and released in 1975. This is technically book one in his Asian saga. He wrote it much later in life than the other books in his Asian saga, but it takes place in the earliest time period, I think, of all the books. That's my understanding. This is actually book one in the Asian saga, and it takes place in the 17th century in Japan. It's the feudalistic area of Japan, so you've got samurais, you've got feudal lords that reign over their different provinces, and they are right on the cusp of transition from sword point warfare, if you will, I guess I'll call it that, to learning about gunpowder and muskets and cannon warfare, things like that. So they are still very steeped in more ancient types of warfare. And I really love that about this book. I think that's really awesome to see. And it follows a character named John Blackthorne. He's an Englishman who has commandeered a Danish vessel to go and seek out the farthest reaches of the globe and claim them for the crown, essentially. And along the way, he's given the blessing of destroying the enemy and things of that nature. And at the beginning of the story, he has reached the point where his ship is the only ship left in the fleet. Most of the others have died, whether from starvation or storms or disease. His ship gets stuck in an incredible storm, and he ends up in Japan. And of course, this is the farthest he's ever been, and he doesn't know the language, he doesn't know the customs, he doesn't know any of that. And it's a really deep character study of an Englishman who learns to be Japanese. And we meet various different characters along the way. We meet Portuguese Catholic priests who are his enemy because he's a Protestant and he hates Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants and all of that. And of course the Danishmen aboard his ship hate the Catholics as well. And so there's kind of this constant feud, both ideologically and politically, that's taking place in the book. We also meet a rather funny person by the name of Rodriguez that kind of befriends John Blackthorne in a way, but also kind of doesn't like him because he's also kind of on the side of the Catholic Church, and so the Englishman is his enemy as well. But they have a really great banter and a very unique relationship that's cool to watch. And of course he does eventually get help from another translator, the official translator for the liege lord of this area, and that is Mariko-san, and she has been under the tutelage of Catholic priests. She has become a Catholic Christian herself, and she has learned Latin and Portuguese and English, and so she's able to translate for him. And she is probably the second main character in this story because a lot of the book revolves around her and Blackthorne getting to know each other. He becomes known as the Anjin-san in this group, and she begins to translate for him and get to know him better, and he starts to learn their customs as a result of being with her. And it's really neat to see the interplay between her character and his. And of course you've got the liege lord of this area of Japan, known as Toranaga, Yoshi Toranaga. He is one of 5 regents in the area that form a council created by a man known as the Taiko. And so it's really interesting to see all the politics between not only the Catholics and the Protestants and the Japanese, who largely follow a Shinto or Buddhist faith. There's a lot of politics between those, but there's also internal politics in the Council of Five Regents as well. And so these feudal lords, called daimyos in the Japanese language, have a lot of disagreements and infighting amongst themselves as well, and jealousies and trying to one-up each other and eventually take control of the other's territories. It's fascinating to watch. And there's a very heavy emphasis on the cultural differences in the book as well, because the Anjin-san, the Englishman, John Blackthorne, comes from a very different perspective when it comes to things like right and wrong, moral practices, social practices. So he's just a complete foreigner, right? And that's to be expected when you're going to a different culture like that. And so he's learning about their sexual practices, pillowing versus being married versus having consorts or concubines. It's just a completely different world to him. And so it's fascinating to watch as he slowly comes around to maybe not totally being Japanese himself, but learning to accept their practices and learning to appreciate them despite their differences of opinion on certain things. So it's just a fascinating character study. I personally think I really enjoyed the character work in this book. And there's a few nautical terrors and nautical battles that happen in the book as well that's really awesome to see play out. And so, yeah, there was a lot of really interesting stuff in this book. So I don't want to give a whole lot away, but I really want to emphasize the setting of this book and what you're going to find when you go to this book. So let's talk about some of the themes. And I want to put my eyes on here because I've got a few notes on some of the themes that I want to highlight. First and foremost, this is an Eastern culture, and this book is very heavily steeped in Eastern philosophy. And that was really exciting for me to read about because I myself am a huge proponent of Eastern philosophy and even certain practices. And so to see all the details coming forth in this book regarding some of those things, I thought that was really, really immersive and engaging. And you also get a tragic love story in the book. You're seeing glimpses of people who have PTSD from wartime and traumatic experiences that they've had during the wars that are going on in the world. You got themes about loss and grief and forgiveness. There's themes of honor and sacrifice, and the consequences of your actions are really presented in stark reality in this book. There's also a very heavy emphasis in this book on accepting your fate. I can't count the number of times that a character mentioned that this was their karma. And in this case, they're using karma in the sense of fate or destiny. This is the role that they were born to play, and they've just accepted that. This is a culture that at the time just really accepted the hand that was dealt to them. And there's a lot of that in Eastern philosophy in general. Buddhism and Zen and Taoism and things like that really emphasize not being attached to the outcomes because it will play out how it will play out. We live and we die, and what happens in between is just the process of getting from life to death. And we just accept it and move on. There's a really heavy emphasis on that in this book. And I think it's a really beautiful concept and one that I really resonated with. And of course, I resonated with that for a while. But it was really interesting to see how it played out in this story. And the book really kind of engages with the question of moralism. Is morality relative or is it objective? Every culture kind of has a different outlook on that because there were times when John Blackthorne really clashed with the local people because of what he observed as their flippancy toward life. You know, if somebody dishonors their liege lord, their head is immediately removed. You know, capital punishment is here and now. Every once in a while, you'll see people in prison, and there is some of that in the book. But a lot of times, punishment is just meted out immediately. Or because somebody has dishonored somebody else, they're told to go and commit seppuku immediately, which seppuku is ritual suicide. And so it's a very different culture, and there's a lot of culture clash between Blackthorn and even the Catholic priests, right? Between the Catholic priests and Blackthorn and the Japanese culture, because they're just so different from each other in that respect. And honor is so heavily emphasized in the book that if there's even the hint of having dishonored somebody else, the person who did the dishonoring will offer to commit seppuku. And so it's just fascinating to read about this stuff and to see those practices during that time period. It can be violent at times, it can be heart-wrenching at times, and it just makes for a really powerful story and a really powerful glimpse at the ancient world. And I mean, I know it's not the ancient world technically, but it's ancient to me. You know, it was the 17th century. I wasn't alive back then. My son teases me because I call it ancient Japan, but I mean, I know it's not technically ancient Japan, but it's ancient to me, okay? So I just really enjoyed seeing some of those things. My personal experience with this book was just fantastic. And that's really saying something because I am not the type of reader that enjoys historical fiction, typically. I have had some good historical fiction experiences. This is one of those. Please hear me say that this was a banger of a book for me. But my experience with historical fiction has been very hit or miss. So I was really pleasantly surprised that I had such a good experience with this book. But I was leery going into it. I was kind of on the fence of whether I would enjoy it or not. And it was also because it was a big chunker. I mean, it's easily like 1,400 pages or more. So it took me all month to read it, you know, and I was just blown away by how good this book is. And I think there's some reasons for that too. Not just because the prose was really good and the story was really engaging and it was well paced. Yes, it was all those things. But there's some personal reasons I think it meant a lot to me. And one of those is the fact that I just am absolutely enamored with Japanese culture. I mean, Asian culture in general, but specifically Japanese. I am really fascinated by Japanese culture and practices and the language. I took Japanese in high school as one of my language electives, and it was really enjoyable for me to be reading this book and to see the Japanese language used in the book, because there is a lot of Japanese language in the book. And it's amazing to me how quickly I remembered a lot of what I had learned in high school from taking Japanese class. I took it for, I think, 2 years, and I'm not fluent at all, and I've lost most of it, but I remembered what a lot of the terms meant and everything, and he kind of guides you along in the book, translating the Japanese for you so you can understand what they're saying. And I thought that was great, and it really helped me to kind of relearn, so to speak, some of the stuff I learned in Japanese class. So my love for Japanese culture and my love for the language, I think, really played into this. And I just love this area of history in general, especially what I call ancient cultures, but specifically samurai and ninjas. The whole feudal era of history is really fascinating to me. And I think that's why I like fantasy in general, is because most of the time, especially with classic fantasy, you're not dealing with guns and stuff like that, cannons. You're dealing with swords and knives and close combat warfare, and I was just eating it up, guys. So yeah, that was really good for me. And so now, guys, I think I've told you all the stuff I really loved about the book. There was one thing that kind of bothered me in the book, and that was just a minor thing. And that was switching between POVs. There are times in the book where characters will be talking to one another, and you're starting from the perspective of one character, and then the other character that they're talking to starts talking, and then all of a sudden it switches to their POV. That was a little jarring at times, but I quickly recovered. It wasn't something that prevented me from reading the book. It was just like, okay, wow, that was a drastic POV shift, and now we're back to the story. So be aware of that when you read the book. If you do read the book, I hope you do read the book, that there are some drastic POV shifts at times. All right, so that's the end of my thoughts on the book. I do want to give you my rating, and this is a wholehearted heart. I absolutely love this book. It is probably going to be one of my best books of the year. I will be shocked if it does not end up on my top 10 list at the end of 2025. So when it gets around to that time, if it's not on my top 10 list, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to have to figure out something, because this was just an absolute masterpiece for me, guys. Can you tell I love it? I don't think you can tell I love it. Guys, I love this book. Read this book if you have not already. At least give it a try. It may not be for you, but I absolutely loved it. Now, I do want to talk briefly about my experience watching the show, because my roommate and I did watch the miniseries on Hulu, the new miniseries. I really, really loved the miniseries as well, but it is somewhat different from the book. They hit most of the major beats from the book, but some of the character moments are very different. Some of the characters that die in the show do not die in the book, and some of the motivations that are presented in the book are not presented in the same manner in the show. So just be aware that it's an excellent show. It really, really is. And I would watch it again and again. But it is very different from the book. For instance, John Blackthorne in the show is much different than he is in the book. He's much more annoying in some ways. And also his learning of the Japanese language and culture does not progress nearly as fast as it does in the book, and there's just not as much detail around his immersion in the culture as there is in the book. And I get it, it's only 10 episodes, they can't do much with it, but they really should have made 2 seasons out of it, you know? And also, Mariko-san is much more stoic in the show than she is in the book, and she's much less interested in John Blackthorne in the show than she is in the book. And I'm just going to leave it at that. And then I mentioned some character deaths were different. But overall, it did hit all the major beats from the book, and I thought it was very well done. I thought the casting was spectacular. With the exception of John Blackthorne, I'm not sure I really liked that actor for his character. The casting otherwise was fantastic. The actor who portrayed Yoshi Toranaga was just absolutely brilliant. Everything I've seen him in, I have loved him in. And when I saw he was going to be Yoshi Toranaga, I was like, well, sold. I'm going to watch this show. And I'm so happy I did. I highly recommend the show to anyone. I have not seen the original miniseries with Richard Chamberlain, so I don't have anything to compare it to in terms of visual media. But boy, this series packs a punch. I highly recommend it. So let's kind of wrap everything up. If you are fascinated by Japanese culture, and specifically this era of Japanese culture, and you like historical fiction, and you like chunky books, this book is going to be a solid win for you guys. Absolutely, highly recommended. And if you don't like all of those things, that's fine. I think you're still going to really enjoy this book. I could be wrong, and every reader is different. But please, please give it a shot, okay? And I would like to hear from you in the comments if you have read this book, what your thoughts are on it. I'd love to be able to dialogue about some of the special character moments and things like that. I will create a special pinned comment where you can talk about spoilers. So look out for that. I know I've said I would do that in the past for other things, and sometimes I forget, but I will remind myself to do it for this because I don't want anybody spoiled. So there will be a spoiler comment below, and I'll pin it so that you can all use it to talk about spoilers with. And if you want to hit me up on the Dragon's Den Discord and talk about it there, you can do that. You can private message me on Discord. Feel free to do that as well. I would love to chat with you. All that information is in the description below. And I think I have talked your ear off long enough. Guys, make sure you're reading more books. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll talk to you soon. And I'd like to give a huge shout out to my patrons. I really appreciate all you do to support my channel.